The Shadow of the Kyffhäuser. Chapter 1. The Wings of the Saleph. The river did not care for emperors. It ran cold and fast through the gorges of Cilicia, fed by the snowmelt of the Taurus mountains, indifferent to the banners that lined its banks, indifferent to the crosses stitched in gold upon the surcoats of 10,000 knights, indifferent to the red beard of the man who stood at its edge and studied it with the calculating eyes of a man who had crossed the Rhine in flood, the Po in winter, and the Danube in the dark. Friedrich Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Germany, King of Italy, Duke of Swabia, and by the grace of God, the most powerful Christian monarch alive, looked at the Saleph River and felt, for the first time in 40 years of campaigning, something that was not quite fear, but was close enough to its cousin to make him uneasy. It was the summer of 1187, and the world was burning. The news had come to Regensburg in fragments, each one worse than the last. A rider from Venice, a letter from the Patriarch of Antioch, a Hospitaller knight, half dead from the road, who had wept openly in the great hall and could barely speak the words. Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the most formidable military mind the Islamic world had produced in a generation, had gathered his forces and was moving against the kingdom of Jerusalem with an army the like of which the Crusader states had never faced. The kingdom was weak. It had always been weak, a thin Christian veneer pressed against the vast body of the Islamic world, held together by the military orders, by the occasional infusion of European blood, and by the perpetual, exhausting miracle of its own survival. Now that miracle was being tested to its limit. Friedrich had not hesitated. He was 64 years old, an age at which most men of his era were already in the ground, but he moved with the energy of a man 20 years younger, driven by a conviction that had only deepened with age, that God had placed him on this earth for a purpose, and that purpose was not yet complete. He had called the Diet of Mainz in March of 1188, but in this telling, the ravens had already come to him in the winter of 1186, and he had moved a year earlier, calling the Diet in the spring of 1187, assembling the greatest army the Holy Roman Empire had ever put in the field. 100,000 men, some said. The chroniclers would argue about the numbers for centuries. What was not in dispute was the spectacle. The forest of lances stretching from horizon to horizon, the thunder of hooves on the roads of Bavaria, the long glittering serpent of the imperial army winding south and east through the passes of the Alps and into the Balkans. He had moved fast, faster than anyone had expected. Faster, perhaps, than was wise. The Balkans had been difficult. The Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelos had been obstructive in the way that only a man who is simultaneously terrified and arrogant can be obstructive. Blocking roads, withholding supplies, sending diplomatic letters full of elaborate courtesy and practical obstruction. Friedrich had dealt with him in the way he dealt with all obstacles, directly, without sentiment, and with sufficient force to make the point unmistakable. He had taken Philippopolis. He had threatened Constantinople itself. Isaac had capitulated, opened the roads, provided the supplies, and sent his own son as a hostage to ensure good behavior. The army had crossed the Bosphorus at Gallipoli in the early spring of 1187, and from there had driven east through Anatolia with a speed that left the Seljuk Turks scrambling. The Seljuks had tried to stop him at Iconium. They had failed. The battle had been brief and brutal, the imperial cavalry smashing through the Turkish lines with the accumulated momentum of an army that had been marching for months and was hungry for a real fight. Friedrich had led the charge himself, which had caused his generals considerable anguish and his enemies considerable terror. The Red Beard, they called him, Barbarossa in the Italian tongue, Rothbart in his own German, and the name had taken on a mythic quality over the decades, so that men who had never seen him imagined something between a man and a force of nature, a figure from the old Germanic sagas transplanted into the Christian present. He was in truth a man, a remarkable man, but a man nonetheless. He felt the heat of the Anatolian summer in his joints. He felt the weight of his armor in the afternoons. He felt the particular exhaustion of command, which is different from the exhaustion of labor. It lives not in the muscles, but in the mind, in the constant calculation, the endless weighing of options, the responsibility for the lives of the men who follow you and the lives of the men who oppose you and the lives of the civilians caught between. He had been carrying that weight for 40 years. It had not broken him, but he felt it. And now he stood at the Saleph River, and the river ran fast and cold, and his engineers were arguing about the best crossing point, and his cavalry commanders were impatient, and somewhere to the south and east, the kingdom of Jerusalem was dying. Friedrich had retired to his tent, a great pavilion of red and gold, the imperial eagles stitched on every surface, the interior furnished with the austere practicality of a man who had spent more of his life in the field than in any palace, and was studying the maps with his chancellor, Gottfried of Viterbo, and his marshal, Heinrich of Calden. The maps were good, better than most, compiled from the accounts of pilgrims and merchants, and the occasional crusader knight who had traveled these roads. They showed the Saleph crossing, the road south through the Cilician gates, the descent to the coast, and then the long march down through the Crusader territories to Jerusalem. The engineers recommend the ford 3 miles upstream, Heinrich was saying, tracing the route with a blunt finger. The current is slower there. The bottom is gravel rather than rock. We can begin the crossing at first light and have the vanguard across by midday. 3 miles upstream adds half a day to the march, Friedrich said. He was not looking at the map. He was looking at the lamp flame, which was burning very still in the airless heat of the tent. Better half a day lost than men drowned, Majesty. Men are not going to drown. I am going to cross this river tomorrow, and I am going to do it at the main ford, and we are going to move. He said it without heat, without emphasis, as a simple statement of fact. This was one of the things that made Friedrich Barbarossa frightening to those who served him. He did not need to raise his voice. The certainty in his tone was more compelling than any amount of shouting. Gottfried cleared his throat. There is also the question of the intelligence from the south. The rider who came in this afternoon? I read his report. Then you know that Saladin has already moved. He has crossed the Jordan. The Crusader army is. I know where the Crusader army is. Friedrich stood, and the two men instinctively stepped back, not from fear exactly, but from the force of his presence, which was a physical thing, like standing too close to a fire. I know what is at stake. That is precisely why we are not going to spend half a day finding a comfortable ford. We cross tomorrow at dawn. At the main ford, I will lead the vanguard myself. Heinrich opened his mouth. Friedrich looked at him. Heinrich closed his mouth. It was at that moment that the ravens came. They came through the open flap of the tent, 3 of them, large and black, with the particular intelligence in their eyes that ravens have, that quality of watchfulness that has made them the companions of gods and prophets in every mythology that has ever tried to make sense of the world. They landed on the map table, scattering the oil lamp so that it guttered and nearly went out, and they looked at Friedrich with their bright ancient eyes, and they did not move. Gottfried made a sound that was not quite a word. Heinrich's hand went to his sword hilt, and then stopped, because what was he going to do? Draw steel against 3 birds? Friedrich looked at the ravens for a long moment. Then he laughed, a short, genuine laugh, the laugh of a man who has been surprised and is not displeased by it. "The Kyffhäuser sends its regards," he said. The legend of the Kyffhäuser was already old in Friedrich's time, though it would grow much older and attach itself more firmly to his name in the centuries after his death, or, in this telling, after his eventual peaceful passing in the fullness of years. The mountain in Thuringia, the sleeping emperor within it, the ravens that circled the peak and would return to their master when the empire needed him most. Friedrich had always been ambivalent about the legend. He was a practical man, a legal mind, a politician of genius. He did not, as a rule, put much stock in omens. But he had been raised in a world where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was not the sharp line that later centuries would draw. And he had lived long enough to see too many things that could not be explained by the natural alone. And there was something about these three birds, their stillness, their directness, the way they had come into his tent at precisely the moment when the question of the crossing was being decided, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. He reached out his hand. The largest of the ravens stepped onto his wrist without hesitation, as if it had done this 1,000 times before. It was heavy, heavier than he expected, and its talons gripped with a strength that was almost painful. It looked at him. He looked at it. "All right," he said quietly. "Show me." What happened next was recorded by 3 separate chroniclers who were present, and their accounts agree on the essential facts while disagreeing on the interpretation, which is the normal condition of medieval historiography. What they agree on is this: the emperor left his tent at dusk, following the ravens, which flew low and slow, as if deliberately pacing themselves for a man on foot. He walked along the bank of the Saleph for perhaps a mile, his bodyguard scrambling to keep up until the ravens descended to a section of the river that the engineers had not surveyed, a wide, shallow stretch where the current spread itself thin over a broad gravel bed, the water barely knee-deep, the bottom firm and even. The ford was perfect. It was, in fact, so obviously perfect that the question of how the engineers had missed it occupied military historians for some time afterward. The most charitable explanation was that they had been looking upstream, as Heinrich had suggested, and had not thought to look downstream. The less charitable explanation was that God, or fate, or the ravens of the Kyffhäuser, had arranged things so that the emperor would find it himself at dusk, following birds, because the story required it. Friedrich stood at the edge of the ford and looked across. The far bank was low and grassy. The road south was visible in the fading light, winding up through the hills toward the Cilician gates. He could hear, very faintly, the sound of his army settling into camp behind him, the clank of armor, the voices of men, the particular smell of 10,000 cooking fires. "Here," he said. "We cross here, at first light." He turned to find his bodyguard captain, a Swabian knight named Konrad von Stefan, a distant cousin, one of dozens, staring at him with an expression that mixed awe and professional concern in roughly equal measure. "The ravens, Majesty," Konrad said carefully. "Where did they go?" Friedrich looked up. The sky was darkening to purple, the first stars appearing. There were no ravens visible anywhere. "They went where they needed to go," Friedrich said, "as shall we." The crossing began at dawn and was completed by mid-morning. The ford was everything the ravens had promised: shallow, firm, wide enough for cavalry to cross 6 abreast. The vanguard, 3,000 heavy cavalry, the flower of the imperial knighthood, was across before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills, and the main body followed in good order through the morning. Friedrich crossed with the vanguard, on his great gray destrier, the imperial standard snapping in the hot Cilician wind above his head. On the far bank, He paused and looked back at the river. The Saleph ran on, cold and fast and indifferent, as it always had, but it had not taken him. In the history that was not this history, it would take him here, or near here, a sudden plunge, a current too strong for an old man in armor, a death that would shatter his army and send it home in fragments and leave Jerusalem to its fate. In this history, he stood on the far bank in the morning sun and felt the particular exhilaration of a man who has cheated something, though he could not have said precisely what. He turned his horse south and put his heels to its flanks. "Move," he said. "We have a battle to reach." The march through the Cilician gates was brutal. The pass was narrow and steep, the road barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast in places. The summer heat reflecting off the rock walls in waves that made the air shimmer. Men and horses suffered. The supply wagons were the worst of it. Great lumbering things that had to be manhandled around the tightest corners, that broke axles on the rocks, that blocked the road for hours while sweating engineers improvised repairs. Friedrich drove the column without mercy, sleeping 4 hours a night, eating in the saddle, appearing at every bottleneck with the same calm, implacable energy that had characterized his entire reign. His commanders worried about him. They had been worrying about him for years, in the way that men worry about a force of nature that they depend on but cannot control. He was 64 years old. He had been on campaign almost continuously for 2 years. He had fought a battle at Iconium that he had no business fighting personally. And now he was driving an army of 100,000 men through a mountain pass in high summer, with the urgency of a man who believed with complete sincerity that the fate of Christendom depended on his speed. They were not wrong to worry, but they were also not right to doubt him. Friedrich Barbarossa had a quality that is rare in commanders, and rarer still in rulers. He was almost always right about the things that mattered, not about everything. He had made mistakes, political miscalculations, military errors that had cost him dearly, but about the large things, the strategic things, the questions of when to move and when to wait, and what was truly at stake, he had a clarity of judgment that bordered on the uncanny. And he was right about this. The kingdom of Jerusalem was dying, and speed was the only medicine. The intelligence that reached him as he descended from the Cilician gates into the coastal plain confirmed his worst fears. Saladin had crossed the Jordan in force. The Crusader army, under King Guy de Lusignan, had been maneuvered away from its water sources and was now trapped on the plateau above the Sea of Galilee, near a place called the Horns of Hattin, 2 volcanic peaks that rose from the plateau like the horns of some great beast. The army was exhausted, dehydrated, surrounded. Saladin had set fire to the dry grass, and the smoke was blowing into the Crusader lines. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, the finest fighting men in the kingdom, were still intact, but they were fighting a defensive battle. And defensive battles against Saladin had a way of ending badly. Friedrich read the report and said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to Heinrich of Calden. "How far?" 4 days' march, Majesty. Perhaps 3 if we push the cavalry? We push the cavalry. He paused. And the infantry? The infantry cannot keep pace with. The infantry follows as fast as it can. I take the cavalry ahead. 3,000 lances. We move now? Heinrich stared at him. Majesty, 3,000 cavalry against Saladin's full army. 3,000 imperial heavy cavalry, Friedrich said, with a precision that made the distinction clear. Against an army that is already engaged, that is not expecting us, that has no idea we are within 500 miles of them. He looked at his marshal with those pale, calculating eyes. I have fought with worse odds, Heinrich. So have you. Heinrich thought about arguing. He looked at the Emperor's face and decided against it. Yes, Majesty, he said. We move now. They rode for 3 days and 2 nights, stopping only to water the horses and snatch a few hours of sleep in the heat of the afternoon. Friedrich rode at the head of the column, setting the pace, which was brutal. Horses went lame and were left behind. Men fell from their saddles with exhaustion and were pulled back up by their companions. The road south through the Crusader territories was good. The Crusaders had built well, whatever their other failings, and the column made better time than Heinrich had thought possible. On the 3rd day, they began to smell the smoke. It came from the north and east, a thick gray haze that lay over the plateau like a shroud, and with it came the distant sound that every soldier knows and no soldier ever forgets, the sound of a battle in progress. Not the sharp, localized noise of a skirmish, but the vast, continuous roar of thousands of men fighting and dying, a sound that has no analog in peacetime, that seems to come from everywhere at once, and from nowhere in particular. Friedrich raised his hand, and the column halted. He stood in his stirrups and looked east, toward the smoke and the sound, and his face was very still. "Formation," he said quietly. The word passed back down the column like a wave. 3,000 knights, exhausted from 3 days of hard riding, straightened in their saddles and reached for their lances and checked their girths and did all the small automatic things that trained soldiers do when they are about to fight. The sound of it, the creak of leather, the clink of mail, the soft percussion of lance butts being rounded and raised, was its own kind of music, the music of an army preparing itself. Friedrich lowered his visor. Through the narrow slit, the world contracted to a strip of hazy sky and brown plateau, and in the distance, the dark mass of the battle. "For God," he said, "for the Empire, for Jerusalem." He put his heels to his horse and the column moved. What the Crusader survivors later described as a miracle, and what the chroniclers of the imperial court described as a masterpiece of strategic timing, and what Saladin's commanders described in the accounts that survived the catastrophe as a nightmare from which there was no waking, was in truth a combination of all three. Friedrich Barbarossa arrived at the Horns of Hattin at the precise moment when the battle had reached its crisis point. The Crusader infantry had broken and fled to the hilltops. The cavalry was fighting desperately to protect the fragment of the true cross that had been brought to the battle as a talisman, and Saladin himself had committed his reserve to the final push that would end the kingdom of Jerusalem. The imperial cavalry came out of the west, out of the sun, at a full gallop. The effect on Saladin's army was immediate and catastrophic. They had no warning. Friedrich had driven his scouts ahead with orders to kill or capture every Saracen outrider they encountered, and they had done their work well. The first indication that anything was wrong was the thunder of hooves, and then the imperial cavalry was among them. 3,000 lances at the charge, the red and gold of the imperial standard visible above the melee, and at the center of it all, the unmistakable figure of the red beard, his great gray destrier, carrying him through the press of men like a ship through water. The Saracen lines did not break immediately. Saladin's army was too well trained, too experienced, too disciplined for that. But they bent, and in bending they lost the momentum that had been carrying them toward victory. And in losing that momentum, they gave the Crusader cavalry the moment it needed to rally. Guy de Lusignan, king of Jerusalem, who had been on the verge of surrender, saw the imperial standard and did what kings sometimes do in moments of extremity. He found something in himself that he had not known was there, and he charged. The battle lasted another 2 hours. It was brutal and confused and costly on both sides. Friedrich took a lance blow to the shoulder that cracked his pauldron and left him with a bruise that would trouble him for weeks. 3 of his household knights were killed. Heinrich of Kaldin had his horse shot from under him and fought the last hour on foot, which he would later describe as the most exhausting experience of his life. But the outcome was never really in doubt after the first charge. Saladin's army, caught between the rallied crusaders and the fresh imperial cavalry, began to fragment. Units that had been advancing turned to defend their flanks. The coordination that had made the Saracen army so formidable dissolved in the chaos of a battle that was suddenly going the wrong way. Saladin himself fought with the courage that all his enemies acknowledged in him. He was in the thick of it, rallying his men, trying to restore order, visible on his black horse with his yellow banner above him. Friedrich saw the banner and turned his horse toward it. What happened in the next few minutes was witnessed by dozens of men on both sides, and the accounts vary in their details, but agree on the essential sequence. Friedrich Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, 64 years old, drove his destrier through the press of the battle toward the yellow banner of Saladin. Saladin's bodyguard closed around their master. Friedrich's household knights cleared a path with a ferocity that was almost inhuman. The two men came face to face in the chaos of the battle, separated by perhaps 20 yards of churned and bloody ground. There was a moment, all the accounts agree on this, when the fighting around them seemed to pause, as if the battle itself was holding its breath. Then Friedrich charged. Saladin was a great commander and a brave man, but he was not, primarily, a warrior in the individual combat sense that the Frankish knights prized. He was a general, a strategist, a politician. He had bodyguards for a reason, but his bodyguards were dead or scattered, and the man coming at him was Friedrich Barbarossa, and there was nowhere to go. The lance took Saladin in the chest. His armor was good, the finest that Damascus could produce, but Friedrich's lance was driven by the full weight of a destrier at the gallop, and the full strength of a man who had been fighting since he was 16 years old. Saladin was thrown from his horse. He was dead before he hit the ground. The yellow banner fell. The battle ended shortly afterward, in the way that battles end when the commander dies. Not all at once, but in a rapid cascade of collapse, unit by unit, as the news spread and the will to fight drained away. Some of Saladin's commanders tried to rally their men. They failed. The Crusader cavalry, reinvigorated by the arrival of the imperial force and the death of their great enemy, pursued the retreating Saracens with a ferocity born of years of fear and desperation. Friedrich sat on his horse in the middle of the battlefield and watched the pursuit, and said nothing for a long time. The smoke from the grass fires was still drifting across the plateau. The sun was going down behind the hills to the west. Around him, the ground was covered with the dead of 3 armies, and the ravens. There were ravens everywhere, as there always are after a battle, were already at their work. He looked at them for a moment. Then he removed his helmet and held it in the crook of his arm, and he looked up at the darkening sky, and his lips moved in what might have been a prayer, or might have been something else entirely. Guy de Lusignan found him there, still mounted, still looking at the sky. The king of Jerusalem was bleeding from a cut on his cheek, and his armor was battered, and his eyes had the particular look of a man who has been very close to death and is not yet entirely sure he has escaped it. He pulled his horse up beside the emperor and looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then he said, in the French, that was the language of the Crusader nobility, "You came." Friedrich looked at him. "I said I would come," he said, in the same language, with the slight German accent that he had never entirely lost. "Did you doubt it?" Guy opened his mouth and closed it again. There was, Friedrich reflected, no good answer to that question. "Jerusalem is saved," Guy said finally. Friedrich looked south, toward the invisible city, still days away across the hills and valleys of the Holy Land. He thought of the ravens at the Saleph. He thought of the ford they had shown him, the perfect ford that the engineers had missed. He thought of the long road from Regensburg, the Diet of Mainz, the crossing of the Balkans, the battle at Iconium, the brutal march through the Cilician gates. Jerusalem is saved, he agreed. For now. He put his helmet back on. Around him, his knights were reforming. The imperial standard was being raised again above the battlefield, and the ravens were circling in the last light of the day, black against the darkening sky, patient and watchful, and very old. "Come," Friedrich said to the king of Jerusalem, "we have much to discuss." He turned his horse south, toward the city that three faiths called holy, and rode into the gathering dark. Chapter 2. The Crown of the East. The city smelled of incense and old stone, and the particular dry heat of a place that has been sacred for so long that the sanctity itself seems to have soaked into the walls. Friedrich Barbarossa entered Jerusalem on a Tuesday, 12 days after the battle at the Horns of Hattin, riding not in the triumphant thunder of a conqueror, but at a deliberate walk, his great gray destrier moving at the pace of a procession, the imperial standard carried before him by Conrad von Stauffen, who had not slept properly in 2 weeks and showed it. The streets were lined with people, Frankish settlers, Syrian Christians, Armenian merchants, Jewish scholars who had been permitted to remain in the city under Crusader rule, pilgrims from a dozen countries who had been stranded by the crisis, and now found themselves witnesses to something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. They cheered, most of them. Some wept. A few simply stared with the blank, overwhelmed expression of people who are watching history happen and are not entirely sure how to feel about it. Friedrich looked straight ahead. He had done this before. Ridden into cities, accepted the adulation of crowds, worn the weight of symbolic moments with the practiced ease of a man who had been performing them since his coronation at Aachen in 1152. He knew how to be an emperor in public. He knew how to hold his back straight and his chin level and his expression composed into something that was neither arrogance nor humility, but the particular quality that lies between them, the quality that the Romans had called gravitas and that Friedrich had simply always had, as naturally as he had his red beard and his pale eyes. But he felt it, underneath the performance. He felt the weight of the city pressing down on him, the accumulated weight of 1,000 years of faith and blood and longing. He had been a Christian all his life in the way that medieval men were Christian, completely, without the possibility of doubt, the faith woven into every aspect of his existence, from the prayers at dawn, to the blessing before battle, to the theological arguments that he genuinely enjoyed and was genuinely good at. And Jerusalem was the center of that faith, the place toward which all of it pointed, the city that existed simultaneously in the physical world and in the imagination of every Christian who had ever lived. He had come here. He had saved it. The fact of that was still settling into him, like water into dry ground. The procession moved through the Street of the Chain, past the bazaars that were half-shuttered in the aftermath of the crisis, past the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where a crowd of clergy had gathered in their vestments to receive him, past the Tower of David, where the garrison was drawn up in salute. Friedrich acknowledged everything with small, precise nods, the nods of a man who is receiving what is due, rather than what is unexpected. He dismounted at the steps of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and handed his reins to Conrad and walked up the steps alone, which was not what had been planned. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, Heraclius, had arranged an elaborate reception with prayers and speeches and the presentation of relics. But Friedrich had a way of departing from plans that made it impossible to object, because by the time you realized he was doing it, it was already done. He went inside. The church was dim and cool after the blazing street, the light filtering through high windows in long, dusty shafts. He walked to the edicule, the small chapel built over the tomb of Christ, and he went inside, and he knelt, and he stayed there for a long time. No one followed him. No one spoke. Outside, the procession waited in the heat, and the clergy stood in their vestments, and the crowd murmured, and the ravens. There were always ravens. Now, wherever Friedrich went, a fact that his chroniclers noted with varying degrees of theological interpretation, circled above the dome of the church in the white Jerusalem sky. When he came out, his face was the same as it always was, composed, controlled, giving nothing away, but his eyes were different. They had the quality of a man who has looked at something very large and very true, and has decided with complete clarity what he is going to do about it. He looked at the patriarch Heraclius, who was a man of considerable political skill and considerably less personal virtue, and who had been watching the emperor's unscheduled devotion with the expression of a man calculating how to turn it to his advantage. "Your Holiness," Friedrich said pleasantly, "we have much to discuss." The discussions began that evening and continued for 3 days, and they were among the most consequential negotiations of the medieval period, though they did not look like it from the outside. They took place in the citadel, in a room that had been hastily prepared for the emperor's use, furnished with the maps and documents and writing materials that Friedrich required wherever he was. The participants were Friedrich himself, his Chancellor Gottfried of Viterbo, Heinrich of Calden, Guy de Lusignan, King of Jerusalem, Raymond III of Tripoli, who had survived Hattin and arrived in Jerusalem 2 days after Friedrich, the Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedfort, who had also survived and was in a complicated political position as a result, and the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, Roger de Moulins, who had not survived. He had died at Hattin, and was therefore represented by his deputy, a Burgundian knight named Armand de Montferrat, who was competent and quiet and watched everything with careful eyes. The Patriarch Heraclius was not invited to the first day of discussions. This was a deliberate signal, and everyone present understood it. Friedrich opened the proceedings in the direct way that was characteristic of him. Without preamble or diplomatic softening, he laid his hands flat on the table and looked around at the assembled men and said, "The kingdom of Jerusalem nearly ceased to exist 3 weeks ago. It will cease to exist permanently, within a generation, if nothing fundamental changes. I am here to change things fundamentally. You will tell me what you think, and I will listen, and then I will tell you what is going to happen." There was a silence. Guy de Lusignan, who was a brave man and a mediocre king, shifted in his seat. Raymond of Tripoli, who was a shrewd man and a better politician than any of them, looked at Friedrich with an expression of careful assessment. "What sort of fundamental changes does the emperor have in mind?" Raymond asked. "The kingdom of Jerusalem will become a direct fief of the Holy Roman Empire," Friedrich said. "The king of Jerusalem will hold his crown as a vassal of the emperor, as the Duke of Saxony holds his duchy, as the king of Burgundy holds his kingdom. The military orders will swear their primary fealty to the empire, not to the Pope. The fortifications of the kingdom will be rebuilt and expanded according to imperial specifications, funded by imperial treasury. The garrison will be reinforced by a permanent imperial military presence of no fewer than 5,000 men, rotated from the empire on a 3-year cycle." Another silence, longer this time. "The Pope," Guy said carefully, "will have something to say about this." "The Pope," Friedrich said, with a pleasantness that did not reach his eyes, "will say what he always says, and I will do what I always do. And in the end, the practical reality will be what it is." He paused. "I have been excommunicated twice. I am still here, The empire is still here. Jerusalem is still here, which it would not be if I had waited for papal permission before crossing the Saleph. Raymond of Tripoli made a sound that might have been a laugh quickly suppressed. The military orders, Gerard de Riedfort said, with the stiffness of a man who is defending a position he knows is weak, owe their allegiance to the Holy See. Their charters can be rewritten. Friedrich said, everything can be rewritten. That is what charters are for. He looked at de Riedfort steadily. The Templars lost nearly their entire fighting strength at Hattin. The Hospitallers lost their Grand Master. Both orders exist today because I rode 3 days without stopping and arrived at precisely the right moment. I am not asking for gratitude. I am asking for a practical acknowledgement of where power now resides. De Riedfort said nothing. He was a man who had made bad decisions at Hattin, decisions that had contributed to the disaster, and he knew that Friedrich knew this, and the knowledge sat between them like a stone. There is also the question of the other Crusader states, Raymond said. He was probing, Friedrich recognized, trying to understand the full scope of what was being proposed. Antioch, Tripoli, Armenia. Antioch and Tripoli will receive the same offer as Jerusalem, Friedrich said. The Armenian kingdom of Cilicia has already been cooperative. They provided supplies and passage without the obstruction I received from the Byzantines. They will be rewarded accordingly. He paused. As for the Byzantines, he let the pause extend for a moment. Isaac Angelos blocked my road, withheld my supplies, and attempted to negotiate with Saladin behind my back. I know this because I have his letters. He will be receiving a visit from my son Heinrich in the spring, and the terms of that visit will be clarifying. Raymond of Tripoli looked at Friedrich for a long moment. He was, Friedrich thought, the most intelligent man in the room, and he was doing the calculation that intelligent men do when they encounter a force that cannot be stopped, not how to resist it, but how to position themselves advantageously within it. And the king of Jerusalem? Raymond asked. What becomes of Guy? Guy de Lusignan looked up sharply. The king of Jerusalem retains his title and his court, Friedrich said. He administers the kingdom in the emperor's name, as his vassal. He is not diminished. He is secured. He looked at Guy directly. You were nearly captured at Hattin. You were nearly killed. Your kingdom was nearly destroyed. I am offering you something that no amount of crusader politics can provide. The permanent military and financial backing of the most powerful state in Christendom, in exchange for a formal acknowledgement of imperial suzerainty. He paused. It seems to me a reasonable exchange. Guy looked at his hands. He was not a stupid man, whatever his failings as a king. He understood what was being offered and what was being taken, and he understood that the alternative, refusing and watching Friedrich withdraw his army and leave the kingdom to rebuild itself from the wreckage of Hattin, was not really an alternative at all. I will need to consult with my barons, Guy said. Of course, Friedrich said. You have until tomorrow morning. The barons of Jerusalem consulted through the night in the great hall of the citadel, with the heat of the summer pressing down on the city, and the sound of the imperial army camped outside the walls providing a constant unspoken argument for compliance. Friedrich did not attend. He spent the evening with Gottfried of Viterbo, dictating letters to his son Heinrich in Germany, to the princes of the empire, to the Pope, to the kings of France and England, to the Byzantine emperor, to the rulers of the remaining Ayyubid territories who were now, in the aftermath of Saladin's death, in a state of confused and leaderless disarray. The letter to the Pope was the most carefully crafted. Friedrich had been writing letters to popes for 40 years, and he had a precise understanding of the form, the elaborate courtesy of the opening, the theological framing that placed his actions within the context of divine providence, the careful distinction between the spiritual authority of the Holy See and the temporal authority of the empire, and then, buried in the middle of the letter where it would be found, but could not easily be extracted and quoted out of context, the substance of what he was actually doing, and why the Pope was going to accept it. Pope Gregory VIII had called the Third Crusade in response to the fall of Jerusalem, the fall that had not happened in this timeline, because Friedrich had arrived in time. This created a complicated situation. The crusade had been called. The emperor had answered it magnificently, beyond anyone's expectations. Jerusalem was saved. The true cross was safe. Saladin was dead. From a purely theological standpoint, the crusade had succeeded, and succeeded in a way that reflected enormous credit on the emperor and somewhat less on the papacy, which had spent the previous decade in conflict with Friedrich rather than cooperation. Gregory was a reasonable man, as popes went. He would understand the situation. He would not like it, but he would understand it. And understanding it, he would find a way to frame it that preserved the dignity of the Holy See while acknowledging the reality of imperial power. Friedrich had done this dance with 3 popes already. He knew the steps. The letter to his son Heinrich was shorter and more direct. The situation here is, as I described in my previous letter, but better. Jerusalem is secure. The kingdom will be reorganized as a fief of the empire. You are to proceed with the Byzantine matter as discussed. Be firm, but not brutal. We need Isaac's cooperation, not his martyrdom. I will return to Germany in the spring, by sea. Have the Diet assembled for June. He sealed the letters and sent them with fast riders, and then he slept for 6 hours, which was more than he usually allowed himself on campaign, and woke before dawn, feeling, for the first time in months, something that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it. Guy de Lusignan came to him at sunrise, with the answer Friedrich had expected, yes, with conditions. The conditions were the kind that men propose when they have already decided to agree, but need to feel that they have negotiated something. Friedrich accepted 3 of them, rejected 2, and modified 1, and by mid-morning the agreement was drafted, and the scribes were making copies, and the thing was done. The formal ceremony of vassalage took place in the courtyard of the citadel, in the full heat of the Jerusalem noon, with the imperial army drawn up in parade formation, and the barons of Jerusalem assembled in their best armor, and the clergy present in their vestments, and the patriarch Heraclius, officiating with the expression of a man who is performing a ceremony he does not entirely approve of, but has calculated that performing it is better than refusing. Guy de Lusignan knelt before Friedrich Barbarossa and placed his hands between the emperor's hands and spoke the words of homage, and Friedrich raised him up and embraced him in the formal manner. And the imperial standard was raised above the Tower of David, alongside the banner of Jerusalem. The crowd cheered. The clergy sang. The ravens circled above. Friedrich stood in the courtyard and received the homage of the barons one by one, and his face was composed, and his back was straight, and his eyes were already looking past the ceremony to the next thing, and the next, and the next. He was not a man who lingered in moments of triumph. Triumph was a waypoint, not a destination. Raymond of Tripoli was the last of the barons to come forward. He knelt with the grace of a man who has made his calculation and is at peace with it. And when Friedrich raised him up, Raymond looked at him with those careful, intelligent eyes and said quietly, so that only Friedrich could hear, "You know this will not hold forever." "Nothing holds forever," Friedrich said, equally quietly. "The question is whether it holds long enough." "Long enough for what?" Friedrich looked at him for a moment. "Long enough to become something that cannot be undone," he said. And then he turned to the next baron, and the ceremony continued. The news from Europe arrived in waves over the following weeks, each wave larger than the last, as the reports of Hattin spread westward and the full magnitude of what had happened became clear to the courts and chanceries of Christendom. The first reaction was disbelief. The Battle of Hattin, the real Hattin, the catastrophic defeat that had happened in the history that was not this history, had been so thoroughly anticipated by those who understood the military situation in the Levant that its reversal seemed almost impossible to credit. Riders were sent to confirm the reports. The confirmations came back. Jerusalem was saved. Saladin was dead. The emperor had done it. The second reaction was awe. This was not the calculated admiration that courts extend to successful rulers as a matter of diplomatic courtesy. This was something rawer and more genuine. The awe that people feel when something they had believed impossible turns out to be possible. When the world reveals itself to be larger and stranger than they had thought. Friedrich Barbarossa had been a great emperor before Hattin. After Hattin, he was something else, something that the medieval vocabulary struggled to name, reaching for words like Invictus and Augustus and Dei Gratia, and finding them all slightly insufficient. The third reaction, in the courts of the kings of France and England, was something more complicated. Philip II of France and Henry II of England, who would, in the history that was not this one, have been preparing to join the Third Crusade, were now faced with a situation in which the crusade had been won without them by the emperor, and the political consequences of that fact were significant and not entirely comfortable. Jerusalem was saved, which was good. It was saved by Friedrich, which was complicated. The empire was now the dominant power in the Levant, which was very complicated indeed. Philip sent a letter of congratulation that was a masterpiece of diplomatic ambiguity, managing to be simultaneously effusive in its praise and carefully non-committal about anything that might be construed as an acknowledgement of imperial supremacy. Henry sent a shorter letter that was more direct and, Friedrich thought, more honest. Richard, Henry's son, the one they were already calling Lionheart, though he had not yet done anything to fully earn the name, sent no letter at all, which Friedrich found more interesting than either of the others. The letter from Pope Gregory VIII arrived 3 weeks after the ceremony of vassalage. It was, as Friedrich had anticipated, a masterpiece of its own kind, warm in its praise of the emperor's achievement, careful in its theological framing, and absolutely silent on the question of the vassalage arrangement and the reorganization of the military orders. Silence in papal correspondence was a form of speech. Gregory was saying, "I see what you have done. I am not going to endorse it explicitly. I am also not going to condemn it. We will proceed as if the question has not been raised, and in time it will become settled fact, and then it will not need to be endorsed, because it will simply be." Friedrich read the letter twice, then set it aside with a small, satisfied nod. He had expected exactly this. Gregory was a reasonable man. The reorganization of the kingdom proceeded through the autumn with the systematic efficiency that characterized everything Friedrich did. He had brought with him, in addition to his military force, a cadre of administrators, lawyers, clerks, engineers, financial officers, who had been selected for this purpose, and who now fanned out through the kingdom with the purposeful energy of men who have been given a large and interesting problem to solve. The fortifications were the first priority. The walls of Jerusalem were sound, but the outlying fortresses, the chain of castles that formed the kingdom's defensive skeleton, had been weakened by years of underfunding and the loss of manpower at 18. Friedrich's engineers surveyed them all and produced a comprehensive report that was, in its way, a remarkable document, a systematic assessment of the military geography of the Holy Land, identifying the key points that needed to be held, the roads that needed to be controlled, the water sources that needed to be secured. Friedrich read it carefully and approved the reconstruction program, allocating funds from the imperial treasury with a generosity that surprised even his own chancellor. This will cost more than the campaign itself, Gottfried observed, looking at the figures. The campaign was an investment, Friedrich said. This is the return on the investment. He paused. A fortress that falls costs more than a fortress that holds. I have been making this argument to German princes for 40 years. They never listen until after the fortress falls. The military reorganization was more delicate. The Templars and Hospitallers were ancient institutions with deep roots in the ecclesiastical structure of Christendom, and their resistance to the new arrangements was not merely political, but genuinely principled. They believed, with sincerity, that their primary obligation was to the Pope and to God, and that subordinating themselves to the Emperor was a compromise of that obligation. Friedrich dealt with this with a combination of patience and pressure that was characteristic of his best political work. He did not demand immediate, unconditional submission. He proposed a framework, the Constitutio Militaris Hierosolymicana, drafted by Gottfried, revised 3 times in consultation with the order's leadership, that preserved the order's internal autonomy and their spiritual relationship with Rome, while establishing the emperor as their temporal overlord in matters of military command and strategic deployment. It was a compromise, and like all compromises, it satisfied no one completely. But it was workable, and workable was what Friedrich needed. Gerard de Ridefort, the Templar Grand Master, remained difficult. He was a man who had made catastrophic errors at Hattin and knew it, and the knowledge had curdled into a kind of defensive aggression, a refusal to acknowledge any authority that might also be in a position to judge him. Friedrich watched him for several weeks, and then, in a private meeting that no chronicler recorded but whose outcome was evident from subsequent events, said something to de Ridefort that caused the Grand Master to resign his position the following day, citing reasons of health. His replacement, a Flemish knight named Thierry of Alsace, was more pragmatic and considerably easier to work with. The question of the Ayyubid successor states was handled with a diplomatic subtlety that surprised those who thought of Friedrich primarily as a military figure. Saladin's death had fractured the Ayyubid Confederation into its component states. His brothers and nephews and generals, each controlling a piece of the former empire, each eyeing the others with suspicion, and the Crusader states with a mixture of fear and calculation. Friedrich sent envoys to each of them, not with demands but with proposals, trade agreements, prisoner exchanges, the establishment of formal diplomatic relations. He was not naive about the long-term intentions of the Ayyubid successor states, but he understood that a fragmented enemy was manageable in a way that a unified one was not, and that the best way to keep the enemy fragmented was to give each fragment a reason to prefer negotiation to war. Aladil, Saladin's brother and the most capable of the successors, received Friedrich's envoy with the careful courtesy of a man who is reassessing his situation. The envoy, a Syrian Christian named Yusuf ibn Batlan, who spoke Arabic and had spent 20 years as a merchant in Damascus and was consequently worth more to Friedrich than any number of knights, reported back that Aladil was interested in a long-term accommodation, that he had no particular desire to continue his brother's war, and that he was primarily concerned with consolidating his own position against his nephew's. Friedrich read the report and authorized a preliminary agreement, a 10-year truce, freedom of movement for Christian pilgrims to the holy sites, the return of certain prisoners, and a trade arrangement that would benefit both parties. It was not the triumphant subjugation of the Islamic world that the more enthusiastic Crusaders had hoped for. It was something more durable, a practical settlement that acknowledged the reality of the situation and created conditions in which both sides could pursue their interests without constant warfare. Friedrich had been making these kinds of settlements in Germany and Italy for 40 years. He knew their value. He also knew their limits. A 10-year truce was 10 years, not eternity, but 10 years was enough time to consolidate what had been won and prepare for whatever came next. He left Jerusalem in November, when the worst of the summer heat had finally broken and the city had settled into the mild golden autumn that was its best season. He left behind a garrison of 6,000 imperial troops under the command of a Swabian knight named Ulrich von Hussen, who was steady and competent and had the particular quality Friedrich valued most in garrison commanders: the ability to maintain discipline without provoking unnecessary conflict. He left behind his administrative cadre, still working through the reorganization. He left behind Gottfried of Viterbo, who would spend another year in Jerusalem compiling the documentary record of the campaign and the subsequent settlement. He did not leave behind the ravens. They were there on the morning of his departure, 3 of them on the battlements of the Tower of David, watching as the imperial column formed up in the pre-dawn darkness. Friedrich looked at them as he mounted his horse, and they looked back at him with their bright, ancient eyes, and he nodded to them as he might nod to old companions, and then he turned his horse north and rode. The journey back was slower than the journey out, which was appropriate. He was not racing to a battle now. He was returning from one, and the return from a great victory has its own rhythm, its own quality of reflection. He rode through the Crusader territories and received the homage of their lords. The Prince of Antioch, the Count of Tripoli, the Armenian King of Cilicia, and each ceremony of homage added another layer to the structure he was building. The structure that was not yet complete, but whose shape was becoming clear. He crossed back through Anatolia in the early winter, and the Seljuk Sultan sent gifts and a letter of congratulation that was also, unmistakably, a letter of submission. Not formal submission, not the kind that required a ceremony and a document, but the practical submission of a ruler who has looked at the situation clearly and decided that cooperation with the emperor is preferable to the alternative. Friedrich accepted the gifts and sent back gifts of his own, and the exchange was understood by both parties for what it was. He was in Constantinople by December. Isaac II Aslos had been, as Friedrich had predicted, clarified by the arrival of his son Heinrich with a substantial military force and a list of imperial demands. The demands had been met. Isaac was still on his throne. Friedrich had not wanted to destabilize Byzantium, which was useful as a buffer and a trading partner, but he was on his throne as a man who understood now the precise nature of his relationship with the Western Emperor. He received Friedrich with elaborate ceremony and genuine anxiety, and Friedrich was gracious and firm, and left Constantinople 3 days later with a treaty that gave the empire significant trading privileges in Byzantine ports and a formal acknowledgement of imperial precedence in the hierarchy of Christian rulers. It was not the subjugation of Byzantium. It was something more subtle and more lasting, the establishment of a relationship in which the relative positions of the two empires were clear, and in which the Byzantine emperor had every incentive to maintain that relationship rather than challenge it. Friedrich sailed from Constantinople in January, through the winter seas of the Aegean and around the Peloponnese and up the Adriatic to Venice, where he arrived in February to a reception that was, even by the standards of a city that knew how to receive great men, extraordinary. The Doge came to the dock personally. The bells of San Marco rang for 3 days. The streets were hung with banners. The crowds were so thick that Friedrich's bodyguard had difficulty clearing a path. He stood on the dock in the February cold, the Adriatic wind cutting through his cloak, and looked at the city and the crowd and the banners, and he felt the weight of it all. Not the oppressive weight of responsibility, which he had been carrying for 40 years and had long since made his peace with, but a different weight, the weight of consequence, of things set in motion that could not be stopped, of a world that was different now from what it had been a year ago and would never be the same again. He was 65 years old. He had saved Jerusalem. He had reorganized the Crusader states as imperial fiefs. He had humbled Byzantium. He had fragmented the Ayyubid succession. He had established the empire as the undisputed dominant power in the Christian world. He had, in short, done what he had always believed he was meant to do. And yet, standing on the dock in Venice, with the bells ringing and the crowd cheering and the ravens, there were ravens here too, on the rooftops of the buildings along the waterfront, watching with their patient eyes. He felt not satisfaction, but something more complicated. The feeling of a man who has reached the summit of a mountain and found that the view from the top, while magnificent, reveals only more mountains beyond. There was still Germany. There was still Italy, with its perpetual complications. There was still the Pope, who had been silent, but would not remain silent forever. There was still the question of succession. Heinrich was capable, but the empire was a structure that required constant maintenance, constant negotiation, constant application of the particular combination of force and intelligence, and patience that Friedrich had spent his life developing. There was still, in other words, everything. He straightened his back and walked off the dock into Venice, and the crowd parted before him, and the bells rang, and the ravens watched from the rooftops, and Friedrich Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, walked forward into the rest of his life with the same steady, implacable energy that had carried him from the Saleph to Jerusalem and back again. He had work to do. Chapter 3. The Eternal Reich. The Diet of Jerusalem met in the summer of 1195, in the great hall of the citadel that Friedrich's engineers had expanded and rebuilt over the preceding years into something worthy of the occasion, a space of dressed stone and cedar beams and tall windows that looked out over the rooftops of the city toward the golden dome that the Muslims called the Dome of the Rock, and that Friedrich had decided, after considerable deliberation, to leave standing. It was a practical decision, as most of his decisions were. The dome was a landmark, a point of orientation, a thing of genuine beauty, and destroying it would have cost him the goodwill of Saladin and the fragile network of accommodations that kept the surrounding territories at peace. But it was also, he admitted to himself in the private hours before dawn, when he was most honest with himself, an aesthetic decision. He had an eye for beautiful things. He always had. The hall was full, fuller than any diet he had convened in Germany, fuller than the great assemblies at Mainz and Regensburg and Worms that had defined the rhythm of imperial governance for decades. They had come from everywhere, from the German principalities, from the Italian cities, from the Crusader states, from the Armenian kingdom, from the newly reorganized territories of Cyprus and Antioch. The kings of France and England had sent representatives, which was not the same as coming themselves, but was more than Friedrich had expected, and less than he had demanded, and the gap between those two positions was, as always, where the real negotiation lived. The Byzantine emperor had sent his son, Isaac Angelos, still on his throne in Constantinople and still deeply uncomfortable about everything that had happened since 1187, had calculated that sending his son was a gesture of sufficient significance to satisfy the emperor without constituting a formal submission that might be used against him domestically. Friedrich had accepted the calculation. The son, a young man named Alexios, 17 years old, with his father's anxious eyes, and Friedrich thought, rather more intelligence, sat near the back of the hall and watched everything with the careful attention of someone who knows he is being educated. The Pope was represented by a cardinal named Cencio Savelli, who would one day become Pope Honorius III, and who was, at this point in his career, a man of considerable ability and considerable caution. He had been sent because Gregory VIII had died in 1187, in this timeline as in the other, and his successor, Clement III, had spent the intervening years in a careful, delicate, and not entirely comfortable accommodation with the emperor. Clement was not Gregory. He was more political, more flexible, and more aware of the practical limits of papal authority when confronted with an emperor who had just saved Jerusalem and reorganized half of Christendom. He had not endorsed the Constitutio Militaris Hierosolymitana. He had not condemned it. He had sent Censio Savelli to Jerusalem with instructions that were, Friedrich suspected, deliberately vague, giving the cardinal room to maneuver and the pope room to disavow whatever Savelli agreed to if it turned out to be politically inconvenient. Friedrich had dealt with this approach before. He found it tiresome, but manageable. He entered the hall at the 3rd hour of the morning, when the summer sun was already high and hot, and the assembled lords and representatives were sweating in their formal robes and beginning to wish that the emperor had chosen a cooler venue for his great assembly. He entered without fanfare. No trumpets, no heralds, no elaborate procession. He simply walked in through the side door, accompanied only by Konrad von Stauffen and a young secretary named Warner of Bolzano, who carried his documents, and took his seat at the head of the great table and looked around at the assembled company with the expression that those who knew him recognized as his working face. Attentive, precise, giving nothing away. The hall fell silent. "We are here," Friedrich said, in the Latin that was the common language of educated Christendom, "to make permanent what has been provisional, to write into law what has been established in fact, and to settle once and for all the question of how the Christian world is to be governed." He paused, letting the weight of that last phrase settle over the room. "I do not propose a tyranny," he continued. "I have never governed by tyranny, and I do not intend to begin. What I propose is a constitution, a constitutio pacis, a constitution of peace, that defines the rights and obligations of every Christian ruler within the framework of the empire, that establishes mechanisms for the resolution of disputes without recourse to war, and that creates the conditions under which Christendom can pursue its common interests, rather than tearing itself apart in pursuit of its particular ones." He looked around the room again. The faces were varied, some attentive, some skeptical, some carefully blank. Raymond of Tripoli, older now, his hair fully gray, but still with those watchful, intelligent eyes, was watching Friedrich with an expression that mixed admiration and wariness in proportions that had not changed much since their first meeting in Jerusalem 8 years ago. Guy de Lusignan, still king of Jerusalem in name though increasingly a ceremonial figure, looked tired. The German princes, the Duke of Saxony, the Count Palatine, the Archbishop of Cologne, had the expressions of men who had heard Friedrich make large proposals before and had learned to wait for the details before committing to an opinion. Cardinal Savelli was writing something on a small wax tablet, his stylus moving quickly. Friedrich noted this and filed it away. "The details of the Constitutio," Friedrich said, "have been prepared by my chancellor and distributed to all parties present. You have had 3 weeks to read them. Today we discuss. Tomorrow we negotiate. The day after tomorrow we sign." A murmur ran through the hall. 3 days was not much time for a document of this magnitude. Friedrich knew this. He had chosen 3 days deliberately. For the same reason, he had always set tight deadlines, not because he expected everything to be resolved in 3 days, but because the pressure of a deadline forced men to identify their real objections rather than hiding behind procedural delay. The Duke of Saxony, Heinrich the Lion's son, a man named Otto, who had inherited his father's stubbornness without his father's genius, raised his hand. The document proposes an imperial court of arbitration with authority over disputes between Christian rulers. This would include disputes between German princes and their neighbors. The princes of Germany have never submitted to external arbitration of their internal disputes. The princes of Germany, Friedrich said pleasantly, have spent the last century fighting each other with a regularity and enthusiasm that has cost the empire incalculable treasure and manpower. The Imperial Court of Arbitration is not an external imposition. It is an imperial institution, operating under imperial law, which the princes of Germany have sworn to uphold." He paused. "Unless Otto wishes to argue that the princes of Germany are not subject to imperial law." Otto did not wish to argue this. He sat down. The discussion continued through the morning and into the afternoon, ranging across the document's provisions with the thoroughness that Friedrich had expected and the occasional flash of genuine insight that he had hoped for. The Italian representatives, the cities of the north, the communes that had been fighting the empire for a century and had reached in the aftermath of Hattin a wary accommodation, raised the question of municipal autonomy. Friedrich had anticipated this and had included provisions that were more generous than anyone expected, guaranteeing the internal self-governance of the Italian communes while establishing imperial authority over their external relations and military obligations. It was the settlement that the Peace of Constance had gestured toward in Undwood 183, and that Friedrich had always intended to make permanent when the moment was right. The moment, he had decided, was now. Cardinal Savelli raised the question of ecclesiastical jurisdiction with the careful precision of a man who has been briefed extensively and is determined to get the exact right answer. The Constitutio proposed a clear division between spiritual and temporal authority. The Church retained full jurisdiction over matters of faith, sacrament, and ecclesiastical discipline. The Empire retained full jurisdiction over matters of property, inheritance, military obligation, and public order. The boundary between these two domains had been the source of the investiture controversy, the great conflict that had torn Christendom apart for a century, and Friedrich was proposing to settle it with a clarity that previous emperors had never managed to achieve. "The Holy Father," Savelli said, "will require assurances that the proposed division does not diminish the Church's authority in matters that touch on both spiritual and temporal concerns. The question of marriage, for example, the question of oaths, the question of marriage," Friedrich said, "is addressed in Article 14. The question of oaths is addressed in Article 17. The question of whatever else the cardinal is about to raise is, I am confident, addressed somewhere in the document, because my chancellor spent 2 years writing it, and he is very thorough." He looked at Savelli with something that was not quite a smile. "If the cardinal finds a question that is not addressed, I would be grateful if he would raise it specifically so that we can address it specifically." Savelli looked at him for a moment, then looked down at his copy of the document. "Article 14, he said, and began to read. The negotiations lasted not 3 days, but 9, which Friedrich had also anticipated. He had said 3 days to create urgency. He had planned for 9 because he understood that men need to feel that they have fought for what they agree to, that a settlement reached too easily is a settlement that will not hold. He was patient through the 9 days in the way that he was patient through everything, not passively, not waiting, but actively patient, driving the discussion forward, identifying the real objections beneath the stated ones, finding the formulations that allowed each party to claim a victory while giving Friedrich what he needed. What he needed at the most fundamental level was signatures. Signatures on a document that established the Constitutio Pacis as the governing framework of Christendom. Everything else, the specific provisions, the particular compromises, the careful language of the articles, was secondary to the fact of the document itself, to the act of signing, to the moment when the assembled rulers and representatives of the Christian world put their names and seals to a piece of parchment and thereby acknowledged, in the most formal and binding way, that the medieval world knew, the structure that Friedrich had been building since the Saleph. He got his signatures, not all of them. The representatives of France and England signed with reservations that were noted in a separate annex, and that Friedrich accepted because the alternative was no signature at all, and a signature with reservations was better than no signature. Cardinal Savelli signed on behalf of the Holy See with a formula that was carefully worded to indicate papal acknowledgement rather than papal endorsement, a distinction that Savelli clearly considered important, and that Friedrich considered largely theoretical. The German princes signed, the Italian communes signed, the rulers of the Crusader states signed, the Armenian king signed, young Alexios, the Byzantine prince, signed on behalf of his father with a hand that trembled slightly, which Friedrich pretended not to notice. On the evening of the 9th day, when the last seal had been pressed into the last pool of wax, and the document was complete, Friedrich sat alone in the citadel's small garden, a walled space of fig trees and a central fountain that someone had planted years ago, and that had survived the various crises of the kingdom, with the quiet persistence of growing things, and looked at the sky. It was a Jerusalem evening, which meant the light was extraordinary. The stone of the city turning gold and then rose, and then a deep amber, as the sun went down behind the hills to the west. The air cooling rapidly as it always did in the desert, the first stars appearing with a clarity that the skies of Germany never quite achieved. He could hear faintly the sounds of the city settling into night, the call to prayer from the mosques in the Muslim quarter, which he had permitted to continue operating under the terms of the truce with Al-Adil, the bells of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the voices of his own men in the courtyard beyond the garden wall. He was 68 years old. He had been emperor for 38 years. He had fought, by his own rough count, somewhere between 40 and 50 significant military engagements, not counting the skirmishes and border actions that were the constant background noise of medieval governance. He had been excommunicated twice and reconciled twice. He had buried 2 wives and 3 of his children. He had built cathedrals and fortresses and legal codes and diplomatic frameworks and the particular kind of institutional structure that outlasts the men who build it, if it is built well enough. He thought about the ravens. They had been with him in one form or another since the Saleph, not always visibly. There were not always ravens present when he looked for them, but he had come to think of them as a kind of presence, a quality of attention that accompanied him through the years after the crossing. He was not a superstitious man. He did not believe in any simple sense that the birds were supernatural messengers, but he believed in signs, in the way that all medieval men believed in signs, as the language through which the divine communicated with the human, a language that required interpretation and could be misread, but was nonetheless real. And the ravens at the Saleph had been, whatever else they were, a turning point. The moment when the history that was not this history had diverged from the history that was. He had been thinking lately about what came after him. Heinrich was capable. Friedrich had always known this, had cultivated it deliberately, had given his son responsibilities and challenges, and the particular kind of education that comes from watching a master work. Heinrich had handled the Byzantine matter well. He had managed Germany in his father's absence with a steadiness that had surprised even Friedrich, who had expected steadiness but had not been entirely certain he would get it. He was not his father. He lacked Friedrich's particular combination of physical presence and intellectual flexibility, the quality that made Friedrich simultaneously intimidating and persuasive. But he was a good king, and a good king was what the empire needed after the extraordinary reign of a great one. The Constitutio Pacis was the key. Friedrich had designed it with this in mind, a document that was not dependent on the personal authority of the man who had created it, that had its own institutional weight, its own mechanisms of enforcement, its own logic of self-perpetuation. The imperial court of arbitration would continue to function whether or not Friedrich was alive to preside over it. The military arrangements in the Crusader states would continue under the garrison commanders and the reorganized military orders. The trade agreements with the Ayyubid successor states would continue because they were profitable for both parties, and profit was a more reliable motivator than ideology. He had built, in other words, a system, and systems, if they are well built, outlast their builders. This was the thing he had understood, more clearly than any of his predecessors, that the empire's fundamental weakness had always been its dependence on the personal authority of the emperor. When the emperor was strong, the empire was strong. When the emperor was weak or dead or a child, the empire fragmented into its component parts, and the whole painful process of reassembly had to begin again. He had spent his reign trying to change this, to create institutions, laws, precedents, structures that would give the empire a coherence that did not depend on any single man's genius or force of will. The Constitutio Pacis was the culmination of that effort. It was not perfect. No human document was perfect. But it was, he believed, good enough. Good enough to hold. Good enough to become, in time, the foundation on which something genuinely new could be built. He sat in the garden until the stars were fully out and the city was quiet, and then he went inside and slept. The return to Germany was a progress rather than a journey, a slow, ceremonial movement through the territories of the empire, stopping at every significant city and castle and monastery, receiving homage and dispensing justice, and making himself visible in the way that medieval rulers needed to be visible, because visibility was a form of governance, presence was a form of power, and the emperor who was seen was the emperor who was real. He moved through Italy first, which was always complicated and always necessary. The Italian cities were the economic heart of the empire. Their trade, their banking, their manufacturing were what made the imperial military machine possible, and they required careful handling, a combination of respect for their autonomy and firmness about their obligations that Friedrich had been calibrating for decades. He held court in Milan, which had been his great enemy in the wars of his youth, and was now, in the aftermath of the Peace of Constance and the Constitutio Pacis, something closer to a partner. The Milanese received him with the elaborate courtesy of a city that has learned through painful experience the cost of defiance, and Friedrich received their courtesy with the gracious firmness of a man who remembers the lessons of the past without being imprisoned by them. He held court in Rome, which was always a performance of a particular kind. The city of the Caesars, the city of the popes, the city that existed simultaneously as a physical place and as the symbolic center of two competing visions of universal authority. Clement III received him at the Lateran with a careful warmth of a pope who has made his peace with a situation he cannot change and has decided to make the best of it. They talked for 3 hours, alone, without secretaries or advisors, in the Pope's private study. What they said to each other was never recorded. What emerged from the conversation, in the weeks and months that followed, was a series of small but significant adjustments to the relationship between the papacy and the empire. Adjustments that moved, incrementally but unmistakably, in the direction of the division of authority that the Constitutio Pacis had proposed. Friedrich left Rome with the particular satisfaction of a man who has had a difficult conversation and had it well. He crossed the Alps in September through the Brenner Pass, which he had crossed so many times that he knew every turn of the road, every village, every view. The mountains were beginning to show their autumn colors, the larches going gold, the higher peaks already dusted with the first snow, and the air had the particular clarity of high altitude in early autumn, sharp and clean and cold. Friedrich rode through it with his cloak pulled close and his eyes on the road ahead, and he felt for the first time in years something that was simply and straightforwardly pleasure. the pleasure of familiar country, the pleasure of going home. Germany received him as it always had, with the complicated mixture of pride and wariness that the German princes had always felt toward their emperor, the awareness that he was theirs, and the awareness that he was also, in some fundamental sense, beyond them, operating at a level of ambition and achievement that they could admire but not quite follow. The Diet that he had called for October assembled at Worms, the old city on the Rhine, the city of the famous Concordat that had ended the investiture controversy 70 years before, chosen deliberately for its symbolic resonance, and Friedrich presided over it with the ease of a man who has been doing this for 40 years and has gotten very good at it. The Diet ratified the Constitutio Pacis for the German territories, incorporating its provisions into the existing framework of imperial law, with the amendments and clarifications that the German princes had negotiated in Jerusalem. It was not a rubber stamp. There were genuine debates, genuine modifications, genuine moments when Friedrich had to exercise all his political skill to find formulations that satisfied competing interests. But it was in the end a ratification, and the document that emerged from Worms was stronger for having been tested against the particular stubbornness of the German princes, who were, Friedrich had always thought, the best possible testing ground for any legal framework, because if it could survive them, it could survive anything. Otto of Saxony, who had raised the question of arbitration in Jerusalem, raised it again at Worms, with more specificity and more force. Friedrich listened to him carefully, which was not something he always did with Otto, and found, beneath the stubbornness, a genuine concern about the practical operation of the arbitration court, about who would sit on it, how its members would be selected, what procedures it would follow, how its decisions would be enforced. These were good questions. Friedrich had answers to most of them, and for the ones he did not have answers to, he appointed a commission, including Otto, which was deliberate, to develop the answers. Otto left Worms looking slightly surprised, which was the expression Friedrich had been aiming for. The Kyffhäuser monument was Heinrich's idea originally. He had proposed it 2 years earlier in a letter that Friedrich had read with a mixture of amusement and appreciation that his son's better ideas always produced. A monument on the mountain in Thuringia, not a tomb, not a memorial, but something living, a complex of buildings that would serve simultaneously as a symbol of imperial continuity and as a practical center of administration for the central German territories. Heinrich had sketched out the plans with the help of an architect from Cologne, and the sketches were good. A great hall on the summit, a chapel, a tower from which the surrounding countryside could be seen for miles in every direction, and at the center of it all, a throne room designed to receive the emperor when he came to hold court in Thuringia. Friedrich had approved the plans and the funding, and construction had begun in 23. By the time he returned from Jerusalem in 1195, the main hall was complete, and the chapel was nearly finished, and he rode up to the summit on a gray October morning to see what had been built in his name. It was, he thought, standing in the great hall and looking up at the vaulted ceiling and the windows that framed the sky, very good. Heinrich's architect had understood something important, that the building needed to be both grand and human, both a statement of imperial power and a place where a man could actually live and work. The hall was large enough for ceremony, but not so large that it became inhuman. The windows were placed to catch the morning light. The throne, carved from a single piece of oak with the imperial eagle on the back and the arms of the empire on the sides, was impressive without being grotesque. Friedrich sat in the throne and looked around the empty hall and thought about the legend that had attached itself to this mountain. The sleeping emperor, the ravens, the promise of return when the empire needed him most. He had not been sleeping. He had been working, which was what he had always done, which was what he would continue to do for as long as he was able. But he understood now why the legend had taken the form it had. The Kyffhäuser was a place that invited myth, that seemed to exist at the boundary between the historical and the eternal, between the particular man and the idea that the man embodied. Friedrich Barbarossa was a man. He knew this, felt it in his joints every morning, felt it in the tiredness that came more quickly now than it had 20 years ago. But he was also increasingly an idea, the idea of the emperor, the idea of a unified Christendom, the idea that the chaos and fragmentation of the medieval world could be ordered, could be given shape and law and purpose by the application of sufficient intelligence and will and patience. He was not sure whether the idea would outlast the man. He hoped it would. He had done everything he could think of to ensure that it would. But hope and certainty were different things, and Friedrich Barbarossa had always been more comfortable with certainty. He sat in the throne for a long time, alone in the hall, while outside the October wind moved through the trees on the mountain. And the ravens, there were always ravens on the Kyffhäuser, had always been, would always be, called to each other in the gray sky. The last great act of Friedrich's reign was the Codex Imperialis, the comprehensive legal code that he had been working toward, in one form or another, for his entire life. It was completed in 1196, the work of a team of jurists led by a Bolognese lawyer named Augustine da Pisa, who was the finest legal mind of his generation, and who had been working with Friedrich's chancery for 3 years on the project. The Codex drew on Roman law, on Germanic customary law, on the legal traditions of the Italian communes, on the ecclesiastical law of the Church, and on the accumulated precedents of Friedrich's own reign, synthesizing them into a single, coherent framework that was intended to govern every aspect of life within the empire. It was an extraordinary document. Later generations would compare it to Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, the great Roman legal compilation of the 6th century, and the comparison was not entirely flattery. The Codex Imperialis was not as comprehensive as Justinian's work. Nothing was, but it was more practically oriented, more attentive to the specific conditions of the medieval world, more careful about the relationship between law and power. Friedrich had insisted on this throughout the drafting process. The law had to be enforceable, which meant it had to be realistic, which meant it had to acknowledge the actual distribution of power in the empire, rather than pretending to a uniformity that did not exist. The Codex was promulgated at a ceremony in Aachen in the spring of 1197. Aachen, the city of Charlemagne, the city of Friedrich's own coronation, chosen for the same reason that Worms had been chosen for the Diet, because the symbolic resonance of a place is part of its meaning, and Friedrich had always understood that meaning was a form of power. He was 69 years old. He stood at the altar of the Palatine Chapel, the great octagonal church that Charlemagne had built and that Friedrich had always loved, with its Byzantine mosaics and its perfect proportions and its quality of concentrated sanctity. And he read the preamble of the Codex aloud, in Latin, in the voice that had not lost its carrying power even after 40 years of use. And the assembled court listened in the particular silence that great occasions produce, the silence of people who know they are witnessing something that will be remembered. We, Friedrich, by the grace of God, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Germany, King of Italy, King of Jerusalem, in the 38th year of our reign, do hereby promulgate this code of imperial law for the governance of all Christian peoples within the bounds of the empire, for the resolution of disputes between them, for the protection of the weak against the strong, for the ordering of commerce and inheritance, and the obligations of military service, and for the establishment of a peace that shall endure beyond the life of any single man, or the reign of any single emperor, being founded not on the will of a person, but on the will of God, as expressed through the reason of law. He read for 20 minutes. The chapel was very still. When he finished, he set the document down on the altar, and looked out at the assembled court. His son Heinrich, his grandson Friedrich, the princes of the empire, the bishops and abbots, the representatives of the Italian cities, the ambassadors of foreign powers. And he said, departing from the prepared text in the way that he sometimes did when the moment called for it, I have spent my life trying to build something that will last. I do not know if I have succeeded. No man can know this while he is still alive, but I have tried, and I have tried with everything I had, and if what I have built does not last, it will not be for want of trying. He paused. Take care of it, he said. It is yours now, as much as mine. He stepped back from the altar, and Heinrich stepped forward, and the ceremony continued. Friedrich Barbarossa lived for 4 more years after the promulgation of the Codex Imperialis. They were not easy years. His health declined gradually in the way that the health of old men declines, not catastrophically, but steadily. The body systems failing one by one with the quiet inevitability of a great machine running down. He continued to work. He continued to hold court, to hear cases, to correspond with rulers across Christendom, to involve himself in the governance of the empire with the same attentiveness that had characterized his entire reign. He simply did it more slowly and with more rest, and with the increasing assistance of Heinrich, who was learning, in the most direct possible way, what it meant to be emperor. He spent his last winter at the Kyffhäuser, which had become his preferred residence in his final years. The mountain air suited him, he said, and the hall was comfortable, and the view from the tower on clear days extended to the horizon in every direction, which he found satisfying in a way he could not entirely articulate. He held a small court there through the winter months, receiving visitors, dictating letters, reading the reports that came in from Jerusalem and Constantinople and Rome and the German principalities, maintaining his grip on the empire's affairs with fingers that were less strong than they had been, but were still unmistakably his. He died in the spring of 1001 Bay Wid. He died in the spring of 12 when nur becord chussid respecter blue of early spring, clear and deep and cold. He died in his bed, which was not how he had expected to die. He had always assumed in the way of soldiers that he would die in the field, but which was, he had come to think in his last months, appropriate. He had spent his life in the field. He had earned a bed. Heinrich was with him at the end, and Konrad von Stauffen, who was old now and gray but still upright, still the same steady Swabian knight who had followed the ravens along the bank of the Saleph 14 years before. And Werner of Bolzano, the secretary, who had been with Friedrich since Jerusalem, and who would spend the rest of his life writing the history of the reign, the great chronicle that would be the primary source for everything that came after. Friedrich's last words, according to Werner, were addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone. The ravens are here. Werner looked around the room. There were no ravens visible. The windows were closed against the April chill, but he wrote it down anyway, because he had learned in 14 years of service to Friedrich Barbarossa that the emperor was almost always right about the things that mattered. The ravens were seen on the Kyffhäuser that morning, circling the summit in the early light. 3 of them, large and black, with the particular quality of watchfulness that ravens have. The garrison reported it. The monks in the chapel below reported it. A shepherd on the lower slopes of the mountain, who had no idea that the emperor had died that morning, reported seeing 3 large black birds circling the summit, and thought nothing of it, because there were always ravens on the Kyffhäuser. There had always been ravens there. There always would be. Heinrich was crowned at Aachen 6 weeks later, in a ceremony that was deliberately modeled on his father's coronation 49 years before. The same chapel, the same ritual, the same words, the continuity made visible and formal and binding. He was a good king, as Friedrich had known he would be. He maintained the Constitutio Pacis. He upheld the Codex Imperialis. He managed the relationship with the papacy with a skill that owed much to his father's example and something to his own temperament, which was more conciliatory than Friedrich's and consequently better suited to the particular challenges of the post-Barbarossa era. When the great structures had been built, and what was needed was not the force to build them, but the patience to maintain them, the kingdom of Jerusalem held. The garrison that Friedrich had established was reinforced twice in the decade after his death, and the fortifications that his engineers had rebuilt proved their worth in the skirmishes and border conflicts that were the constant background noise of life in the Levant. Al-Adil, Saladin's brother, honored the truce for its full 10 years and then negotiated a renewal because the trade arrangements were profitable, and the alternative, war with the empire, was not something he wished to contemplate. His successors were less consistent, and there were crises in the decades that followed, moments when the kingdom seemed again on the verge of collapse. But the imperial framework held each time because the framework was larger than any single crisis, because it had been built to hold. The Constitutio Pacis became, over the following century, the foundational document of European governance, not in the sense that it was always obeyed, because no law is always obeyed, but in the sense that it established the terms of reference within which disputes were conducted and settlements were reached. The Imperial Court of Arbitration heard its first case in 1198, and its 1000th in 1243, and by the middle of the 13th century, it had become so embedded in the practice of European politics that it was difficult to imagine how disputes had been resolved before it existed. The answer, of course, was war, and the memory of that answer was part of what made the court's authority durable. The legend of the Kyffhäuser grew, as legends do, in the years after Friedrich's death. The sleeping emperor in the mountain, the ravens that circled the peak, the promise of return when the empire needed him most. In this timeline, unlike the other, the legend had a different quality. Not the melancholy of a great reign cut short, not the longing for a return that would never come, but something more complex and more interesting. The sense of a man who had done what he set out to do, who had built what he intended to build, and who rested now not in defeat, but in completion. The emperor who slept in the Kyffhäuser was not waiting to save the empire. He had already saved it. He slept because his work was done. Werner of Bolzano finished his chronicle in 12010, 9 years after Friedrich's death, and dedicated it to Heinrich with a preface that was, by the standards of medieval dedication, unusually direct. I have tried to write the truth of what I saw and heard, knowing that the truth of great men is always larger than any chronicle can contain, and that what I have written is therefore incomplete, as all human accounts of great things must be. But it is true, as far as I could make it true, and I offer it to posterity in the hope that they will find in it not merely the record of a reign, but the record of a possibility. The possibility that the world can be ordered, that chaos can be given shape, that the long human project of living together without destroying each other can be advanced, if not completed, by the application of sufficient intelligence and will and patience, and, perhaps, the guidance of ravens. The chronicle was copied and recopied across the monasteries of Europe. It was read in the schools of Bologna and Paris. It was translated into French and Italian, and eventually into German, the language of the man it described. It became, in time, one of the foundational texts of the medieval historical tradition, the account against which all subsequent accounts of Friedrich Barbarossa were measured, and in the margins of the oldest surviving copy, made by a monk in a Thuringian monastery sometime in the early 13th century, someone had drawn, in careful ink, 3 ravens in flight. No annotation, no explanation, just the birds, rendered with a precision that suggested the artist had looked at real ravens and tried to capture something true about them, the breadth of the wings, the intelligence of the eye, the quality of watchfulness that was their most distinctive characteristic. The monk's name was not recorded. He had simply seen something in the text that he wanted to make visible, and he had made it visible, and then he had moved on to the next page, and the next, and the work of the monastery had continued, as it always did, as it always would. Outside, on the roof of the scriptorium, a raven sat in the morning light and looked at nothing in particular, or perhaps at everything. With the patient, ancient attention that ravens have always had and will always have, long after the emperors and the chronicles and the monuments have returned to the earth from which they came. It sat there for a long time, then it spread its wings and flew. Thank you for listening. If you like this story, please subscribe for more.